I'm delighted to share with you the next installment of the Armed Resistance and Black Liberation segment of Dr. Umoja's seminar on Black activism for fall 2024. This installment is the book We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance by Kellie Carter Jackson. I'll talk a bit about the author and how this book fits in with her other work, and then a bit about 5 areas of refusal she discusses, which are from revolution to joy, and then her concluding remarks in a section called Drowning. So Kellie Carter Jackson is the chair of Africana Studies at Wellesley College, and she informs her work with her family experiences, home life, culture, as well as her undergraduate degree in journalism from Howard and graduate study at Columbia in American history. She studied there under the great Eric Foner, the venerable historian. She does a podcast thing that's all things Oprah. It's pretty interesting. And she came on the scene in the book publishing world in 2017 as co-editor of a book called Reconsidering Roots. And that book was everything to do with Alex Haley's groundbreaking book in 1976 and miniseries in 1977, and the ramifications of the book internationally, nationally, in a variety of ways. One chapter was about the impact the book is having on the increase in the interest in genealogy among African Americans. And because I study African American genealogy books, that is what got me interested in her. She makes it a point in the introduction, she co-writes as co-editor to say that descendants honored Kunta Kinte's memory, and it was important that they took the time to tell the next generation about their ancestor called the African. Her second book, which is her signature book, is called Force and Freedom. And in that book, she talks about how Black abolitionists' tactical violence actually was the cause of the Civil War. Black people actually using violence, talking about violence in rhetoric. So she argues it's not John Brown, it's not moral suasion, it's none of those other things, military, tactical ideas. She says it is indeed Black people's focus on violence that led to the Civil War and our freedom from enslavement. And then this book, which came out this year, she makes it a point to dedicate it to her 3 free, beautiful Black children, and she wants her readers to know that these children bear the names of ancestors. She writes this book in the atmosphere we've talked about somewhat of scholars de-emphasizing the violence, de-emphasizing the use of guns, de-emphasizing the use of weapons in favor of nonviolence. We talked about it largely with respect to the civil rights movement and some of the books that specifically write against seeing that era primarily as a nonviolent era. And she's writing in the context of memes that are going around now with particularly young people saying basically that they do not revere their ancestors' nonviolent activity. It's saying specifically, I am not my ancestors in that sense, and I will use these hands, meaning they didn't. She also writes in the context of white audiences often thinking the stories of Black nonviolence are synonymous with stories of subordination. And therefore, she says there's a reluctance among some to tell and know how to revere those stories. And she's writing in the context of the market being flooded right now with books about Black trauma and how to heal it. So in that context, she reframes violent reactions and nonviolent reactions. She says we engage in them both, while the violent actions often result in martyred heroes, they also result in certain death. And while the nonviolent acts are often seen as passive, they do have the power sometimes of moral suasion, and they have the negative impact of having some descendants not revere their ancestors. So her reframing this dichotomy of violent reactions versus nonviolent reactions into what she calls refusals, that all of these activities, the whole array of them, are self-focused, goal-oriented responses to white violence. And when we refuse, no matter be it violent or nonviolent refusal, we end up with a limp. We will always show the scars, the wrinkles, the mishealed wound that comes from refusals. So that is her reframing. She wants us to see ourselves as people who limp because we refuse, and we refuse in both violent and nonviolent ways. And she's making this argument in a very universal way. She says simply to be Black in America is to limp. And our whole being is a history of refusal. We're always saying, no, nope, no, not today, Satan. And she makes it a point in an anecdote I'll share with you in a moment to say that someone took the doctor out of the equation, making the point that the Black person who was being protected was the most important factor. Someone who was trying to do her harm is not the focus. And Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson says that refusal is Black people's way of winning. This is how we win equity and equality. And refusal is attitudinal. It's the why we do something. Again, what are the intended outcomes? She says that it is possible to win by refusing, and we have actually accomplished this. She goes over an array of anecdotes that demonstrate this, and she makes it a point to say that one of the greatest benefits of refusal is its sustained nature. And then she points out that we must be honest about what actions produce structural results and what actions produce symbolic results, which are the shorter term ones. So in a nutshell, this is the book. It's all about refusing white violence. She begins each of the 5 categories of refusal by sharing a family story. So she begins the book with the story of her great-great-grandmother, who saves her great-grandmother, Arnesta, who as a child stepped on a rusty nail, and Arnesta's mother took her to a white doctor, and the doctor said he definitely would care for her foot if the mother would hire her out to the physician. And while the mother was about to agree or had agreed, her mother, meaning the writer's great-great-great-grandmother, intervened and protected our Nesta from being farmed out to the white physician, and she hugged and kissed her and used herbs and did what she could for the foot. But our Nesta always had a limp after that. So that is her framing device to say that just as her great-grandmother limps, we all limp, and it's all related to efforts to resist. So she goes over a number of people and events that are well known, some that are not so well known, like the Haitian revolutionaries, the Great Migration, Reverse Migration, Daisy Bates, Angela Davis, Maria Stewart, some of the more well-known ones, as well as names we don't know. She just weaves all these people's stories together in these various modes of refusal, and that is her book. So in the revolution section, she says that revolution is structural change. It is forfeiture. It means white people are actually radically redistributing their resources to Black people. It's how we foster an equitable society. And she says, at the heart of revolution is asking the hard questions about our own identity, which is why she begins each section with a story from her own family. And she says that the past is useful for understanding both who we are and where we might go. Again, justifying her use of family stories. And in the revolution section, she talks about largely the people we know and some other stories from the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and what she calls the true American Revolution, which is the antebellum, Civil War, and postbellum eras of the United States. In the protection section, she describes protection as a defensive stance. She gives an example of someone or that overall it is barricading the oppressor from the safe spaces that offer Black people reprieve. She says that protection in a white supremacist world is an anomaly, and that protection is collective action to sustain individuals' safety. And she gives an example as a white perpetrator lay on the ground, the women put an end to him. Again, she begins with the story from her family. She talks about protection in the sense of people going to college early on and giving orations about the importance of refusal, violence, nonviolence. She gives some examples from Oberlin College, and it's just a reminder that we started the earliest documentations of our going to college in the United States are in the late 1700s, and then the historically Black colleges started in 1837. And again, these are thought of as safe spaces that offer Black people reprieve. And then her category called Force, represented by our favorite couple and our favorite photograph of them, our favorite photograph of our favorite couple who represents this kind of force. So this section talks about force being the energy that is needed to influence people to change. It is a remedy to the white violence of terrorism. It's the possibility of white supremacist danger being curtailed. And it goes up against white rage, and sometimes force is fortitude, meaning you're forcing yourself not to hold on to ideas that jeopardize your well-being. So again, this section is specifically about guns and people who use guns and finding guns in different places and not knowing so-and-so was packing, and when the shots are used as warnings, when they're fired at someone, it's self-defense. And she says specifically that guns were not just about exerting force, they were also an expression of freedom in a broader sense, of independence and of courage by Black women. In the flight section, she says flight is one of the most common actions in the history of Black resistance. Running away to swamps, forests, or neighboring plantation are prominent examples. People left with their families, they left with their labor, which flies in the face of saying enslaved people did not leave the plantations with any skills they then utilized in their later lives. They left with their skills, their genius, and their artistry. They policed, when they are policed by trapped or inhuman conditions, that's when and why we leave. And relating to that idea of fortitude as force, people flee if they're surrounded by people who give them a sense that they can't do any better. So again, the story begins with family anecdote, and it includes people who fought in various, who went to Liberia, Haiti, Canada, etc., went to the North, went back to the South. And she says that Jamaica Kincaid's classic work, A Small Place, brilliantly lays out the rage and resentment that Native people have regarding the one who can escape, the tourist. And flight is intended to give people choice, decency, and dignity. And then in her final section of categories of force or categories of refusal, she says joy is a form of refusal, and that it's birthed from hard places. It's the antidote to trauma and loss. And she says she's always felt that white people get to be happy while Black people get to have joy. And we can talk about those differences. And she says, when I think of joy, I think of the Black church, and joy is employed to dispel and destroy whiteness as supreme, aspirational, or the norm. So that is the purpose of joy, she says. And she, again, weaves a variety of anecdotes that show joy in different ways in our lives. And then she concludes the book, We Refuse, by talking about drowning as a metaphor for what will happen to Black people if we let white people determine the contours of our refusal. It's sort of a Malcolm X-ish conclusion that all of this trauma, like we're drowning and then they're coming to help save us. But when someone's trying to save you, often they end up drowning. You end up fighting your rescuers, and you can drown. She says that news coverage of the latest racial boogeyman, be it critical race theory, woke culture, or conspiracies regarding stolen elections, all of those are the kinds of drowning that we face. She says Black Americans and other people of color cannot risk their lives saving someone who is unwilling to recognize the harm their panic is causing. She says we can let whiteness drown in the violence of its own making. Drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers. And again, she says, let us not be the ones who drown as they try to save us. When people of color refuse, quit, leave, withhold, strike, boycott, or simply carve out spaces that deny white gazes or do not allow white people entry, institutions must concede. So she is convinced that Black people's way of being, which she says historically is the state of refusal, ultimately, no time frame on it, means that white people must concede. So that is Kellie Carter Jackson's We Refuse in a nutshell. In summary, it's a book about the rhetoric and embodiment of refusal. It makes a point to showcase women, be they wives or mistresses or other women who engage in words of force or refusal, or people who engage in actions such as being marooned or singing or transporting ammunition or mocking oppressors. And the result of all this refusal is that we live a life with a permanent limp. And now I'm delighted to have discussion and questions. Here we can see some of the questions that came to my mind, and we can pull out concepts from them or any other thing you want to ask. I say that in dedicating We Refuse to her free children and beginning the book with an act of refusal that a born enslaved great-great-great-great-grandmother of these free children undertook, does Jackson undermine the oft-touted notion that none of us is free until we all are free? And we can explain this concept of we refuse juxtaposed with we choose, or whether the we is a growing number. How and why do Jackson's accounts of Black refusal demonstrate knowledge and implementation of military strategy? Parallels between Robinson's notion of the movement being too tied up with the Democratic Party and the notion of it being too tied up with academia. What implications do political and pedagogical alliances suggest for violent strategy? And that relates to this array of books on this topic in the academic realm. What are these doing in the broader realm, etc.? How does violence interact with the concept of labor-based institutions? How does birthright citizenship relate to self-identity, accelerating and undulating this refusal she talks about? Is this a constant thing? again, she says we must be honest about what actions produce structural results and what actions produce symbolic results. So what are those two? What are our long-term symbolic results? And you can read through some of the others and see if any of the questions strikes you. What are movement ramifications of experiencing language and erasure as violence? What are contemporary parallels to the 1865 to 1915 era? Again, this idea of descendants now having less reverence for a real ancestor they think was insufficiently violent, and a mythologized or an imagined ancestor who fought like Django. And it makes me think about, I guess this is really related to this idea of sustainability. So we talked about the various theories of activism. I love looking at how it works in different sites that we each are engaged in. And then what does that mean if we were to teach activists? Would they need to be taught military strategy? Would they need to be taught, we talked about Mein Kampf being, one of the books that the Black Power people, or specifically that the Black Panthers had to read. Is there a small canon? Because once you start getting too much, then it's too much. So yes, things like that, a whole variety of questions. And I let you know some of the resources I utilize. And again, I look forward to discussion and questions.